Hello, and welcome to today's daily study. Today we're going to be going over kind of the rest of Acts 18 because there's a lot of really interesting things in here that I think would be very beneficial to the study of Acts. And uh, some of them have to do really with the Lord and his preparation of certain people to be useful vessels in carrying the word to the world. Paul was, of course, very specifically referred to as a chosen vessel to the Lord. And to a certain extent, we are all indeed chosen and set apart for preaching the gospel and carrying it to the world. Every member a missionary, that whole idea that stems from the fact that every single person in the church has an obligation and a duty to share the gospel of the Lord in whatever way he can, in whatever way they can. The Lord doesn't expect you to go out and stand on the rooftops if you're in a wheelchair. He's not expecting you to go out and do things that are impossible to you. But whatever you can do, you should be doing to spread the word of the Lord. And for people like me, a lot of times that comes into making YouTube videos and or Rumble videos or videos that I can put on various social media platforms to help explain and talk about the teachings of the Bible and the church and whatnot. But the Lord has prepared a lot of people with many different abilities and capacities in order for them to succeed in teaching the nations of the world so that everyone can at least get a baseline, and in that baseline be able to determine for themselves whether they want to continue, whether it's something that they truly want to believe in, or whether it's something that they want to dismiss. And so, but that gets on a little bit later. And first, we talk about kind of the way that the Lord prepared some people to help advance the mission of Paul. Not even so much to believe in Paul, but to advance his mission. And so, when Gallio, the deputy of Achaia, the Jews made insurrection with one accord against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat. Um, and so Gallio was basically the governor of Achaia, which was southern Asia or whatnot. And the Jews made insurrection. So the Jews, they all gathered together and they wanted to get Paul in trouble and brought him to the judgment seat. Remember, the Jews did the same thing with Jesus Christ. And yet we see how Gallio was at least prepared in a small extent to help Paul in his mission, saying, "This fellow persuadeth men to worship God contrary to the law." And when Paul was now about to open his mouth, Gallio said unto the Jews, "If it were a matter of wrong or wicked lewdness, O ye Jews, reason that I should bear with you." And so he's like, if this was about the actual law, like if he was actually doing something illegal, then I would listen to you guys. But if it be a question of words and names and of your law, look ye to it, for I will be no judge of such matters. In other words, it's something about your tradition, your religion, and stuff like that. So you do whatever you need to with that and leave me alone. Um, and he drave them from the judgment seat. In other words, he sent them out. And so in this, we see that even though Gallio had a lot of the same pressure as as Pilate uh, did with Christ, then he took kind of a very strong stance saying, "Hey, this isn't my problem. This is your guys' problem. You go and do whatever you want to about this. You see to your problem." Again, they couldn't put Paul to death. They couldn't kill him. But he's like, this isn't something even worthy of death. So you go on to yourself, for I will be no judge of such matters. In other words, I'm not going to occupy myself with this. Then all the Greek took Sosthenes, the chief ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat. And so they took this guy Sosthenes and they beat him outside, and Gallio cared none of those things. So in other words, Gallio didn't interrupt them. And so in this way, we see that he was able to continue in his teaching and stuff even after they brought him before this magistrate. And this magistrate, like, he didn't want anything to do with it, not realizing that indeed the Lord had prepared this situation so that Paul could proceed with his missionary efforts. Because it says, and Paul, after this, tarried there yet a good while, and then took his leave of the brethren, and sailed thence into Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila. So Priscilla and Aquila joined Paul when he sailed to Syria. And then it says here that Paul, having shorn his head in Cenchrea, for he had a vow. So Paul had shaved his head, basically, because he had made a vow. Now, we don't really know what the vow was, but we do know that he had made a vow and he was intent on keeping it. And that's what the shaving of the head meant. That was to serve as a reminder of this vow so that you wouldn't forget it. And he came to Ephesus and left them there. But he himself entered into a synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. And when they desired him to tarry longer time with them, he consented not. And so, in other words, he went to Ephesus, and there he was teaching inside the synagogues. And the people who were with him, probably Priscilla and Aquila, had desired for him to stay longer, but he denied. Like, he said, no, I'm not going to stay longer. But bade them farewell, saying, I must by all means keep this feast that cometh in Jerusalem, but I will return again unto you, if God will. And he sailed from Ephesus. In other words, he's saying here that I am going to keep this feast in Jerusalem by any way that I can. I'm going to go to Jerusalem to keep the feast. But if the Lord calls me to come again, then I will. And then he left them. And when he had landed at Caesarea and gone up and saluted the church, he went down to Antioch. And after he had spent some time there, he departed and went over all the country of Galatia and Phrygia in order, strengthening all the disciples. And so this is what I was talking about kind of at the beginning. Right here is about a certain Jew named Apollos. Now, Apollos had been prepared by being ready to hear the word of Christ by actually being a follower of John the Baptist. And it says here, a certain Jew named Apollos, born at Alexandria, an eloquent man, so one who could speak very well, and mighty in the scriptures, who knew the scriptures very well, came to Ephesus. And the man was instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in the Spirit, he spake and taught diligently the things of the Lord, knowing only the baptism of John. And so here he was in Ephesus, and he was teaching whatever the Lord wanted to teach, but only along the lines of John, the baptism of John, the baptism of water. And he began to speak boldly in the synagogue, whom, when Aquila and Priscilla had heard, took him unto them and expounded unto him the way of God more perfectly. And this is a perfect example of every member missionary. Here, Aquila and Priscilla had joined Paul for a certain amount of time, and they were members of the church now at Ephesus. And they saw this man who knew the scriptures and was teaching about the baptism of John, in other words, the baptism of water, and they knew that he was ready to hear more. And they invited him to their home, and they talked to him about the gospel of Jesus Christ and taught him about the gospel of Jesus Christ in their own home. And when he was disposed to pass to Achaia, the brethren wrote, exhorting the disciples to receive him, who, when he was come, helped them much, which had believed through grace. In other words, he believed what was taught to him from Aquila and Priscilla, And he became able to teach the gospel of Christ in a more perfect way, to the extent that it became a great blessing to the disciples who lived in Achaia. Uh, for he mightily convinced Jews, and that publicly showing them by the scriptures that Jesus was Christ. And so, in other words, because of the teachings of the church, the church of these saints, when Christ was, or at least when the contemporaries of Christ were still on the earth, that Jesus was indeed the Messiah, and he had much success, for he mightily convinced the Jews. In other words, that he wasn't able to be easily dissuaded, and his knowledge of the scriptures allowed him to very easily, I guess, rationalize his arguments to the point that he was able to show many that Jesus was Christ, that Jesus was the Messiah, indeed the one who was prophesied of in the scriptures. And this is a very important story of not only every member a missionary, but as well of the fact that this man, Apollos, born in Alexandria, was prepared. He was prepared because the Lord had spoken to him and showed him the truth of the teachings of John in order to plant that seed so that later on he could be taught by Aquila and Priscilla that are about Jesus Christ, and therefore expound his knowledge and give him an even better part than that which he arrived with. He came and he was teaching in the synagogues about the baptism of John, and he was very mighty in that teaching. Imagine how much more powerful it was when he had the full knowledge. It says, knowing only the baptism of John, and expounded unto him the way of God more perfectly. These lines here, knowing only the baptism of John, and expounded unto him the way of God more perfectly, that perfectly describes the way that we learn in the church, the way that we are instructed by our Heavenly Father, is that we come knowing only a certain small percentage of things. And yet, as we learn more from our Heavenly Father and more from those around us, especially in the church and especially with things about the gospel, that we become more knowledgeable about the ways of God, that we are more perfectly instructed so that we can overcome even greater opposition. And so it says in 28 how effective that was, for he mightily convinced the Jews, and that publicly showing by the scriptures that Jesus was Christ. And so here we see that because he had received an even greater knowledge, that he was even more mighty in his ability to convince the Jews and to show them publicly that Jesus was indeed the Messiah. And I think that this is a great example of how the Lord prepares those certain people to help bring in his church, to help raise up and to expound on the knowledge that we all are gracious partakers of when it comes to the teachings of our Heavenly Father and Jesus Christ. So, and we see that a lot with the modern day apostles and prophets, and how amazing their teachings can be when you understand the true gospel of Jesus Christ, and how that helps expand your knowledge and your understanding in ways that help you to better overcome the derision and the I guess the combating of others against you and your particular testimony. Anyways, thank you guys so much for joining me today, and I hope very much to speak with you tomorrow.